this is chaos and cruelty and callousness, in ways that I wouldn't wish upon my enemy. Science fiction, end of day scenarios that we're discussing. But it's felt to me like for a very long time, like Donald Trump is itching to try to find a way to, for example, just deploy soldiers to the streets. He said, why can't they just shoot protesters in the legs? He said, I want people to stand up when I enter the room and salute me the way the North Koreans salute Kim Jong-un. And he's clearly, it seems, trying to...
Hello, friends. We are really lucky and really fortunate to have as our very special guest, lawyer and political commentator Glenn Kirschner. Glenn and I got to know each other a little bit back in the day when we were both commentating for MSNBC. And I've always been greatly impressed with Glenn, not just for his incredible legal knowledge and ability, but also for his capacity to bring things down in a clear and compelling way for his audience. As one of my friends put it, he knows how to get it down where the goats can get it. And I know he's going to have some very special insights for us this evening. So thank you, Glenn, for being on our show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
To give Glenn his formal introduction before we get started, Glenn is an American attorney and former U.S. Army prosecutor and a former assistant U.S. attorney in the Office of the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia. He's also a former, as we mentioned, NBC and MSNBC legal analysis. You can catch him on YouTube, Glenn Kirschner, at Glenn Kirschner 2. He also has a podcast, which you can find on Spotify or any other sort of podcast apps. It's called Justice Matters. Glenn, was that a good formal introduction or what?
Great introduction. I appreciate it.
All
okay,
right.
Now your first question.
My first question. Without elaboration, I'll ask you to elaborate in a moment. Can you tell us which of the legal challenges to what Trump and Musk are doing are most likely to succeed and which are least likely to succeed?
Gosh, there are so many, but I think when you have Musk and Trump's administration engaged in this sort of wholesale firing of employees without cause, and frankly, they're engaged in misdirection because they are telling thousands and thousands of federal government employees, this is the probationary employee case that I'm talking about right now, that they're being terminated for performance-based reasons. And I'm sorry, that's a flat out lie. There were no assessments made of how these new employees were performing. And I'm trying not to elaborate. I'm going to try to follow the rules here. But I do think it's a special kind of sin, I'm going to call it, when you tell all of these young people, some of whom have been with the government for a week, some a month, some just shy of 2 years, that even though you've decided to dedicate your career early on to public service, we want you out for no good reason. That is so disrespectful and corrosive and harmful. And just a couple of days ago, a federal judge in California said those firings were illegal. I certainly think that suit has a good chance of working its way up the appellate track and being sustained by the appeals courts.
Do you think it would be sustained by the U.S. Supreme Court if it gets there?
Alan, that is a question that I used to think I was able to answer. The problem is the Supreme Court is no longer an honest broker of the law or the Constitution, in my opinion. I choose to quote one of our preeminent constitutional scholars, Yale Professor Akil Reed Amar, who has said flat out that in the presidential immunity case, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution is unconstitutional. Once they've crossed that bridge and they're no longer loyal to the express terms of the Constitution, it's very hard to predict how they will decide cases in the future. So I think it's anybody's guess as to what they will do with many of these cases, which inevitably will bubble up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Do you think that Musk's firings and his other interventions in the federal bureaucracy violate the appointments clause of the Constitution, which say principal officers have to be appointed by the president, approved by the Senate, or if you're an inferior officer, which clearly isn't, that has to be set up by Congress?
It feels that way. It feels like he is sort of a freelance hitman, at least figuratively speaking. And I guess Donald Trump will say, no, 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 no. He's not taking any action on his own. He's really just making recommendations. And I'm the one directing that these terminations, take place. I don't know that I buy that. I buy very little of their explanations because it seems like every time they are caught violating the law or a preliminary injunction is issued against them or a temporary restraining order is issued against them, they try to come up with other explanations for why they're doing what they're doing. And frankly, I don't buy it.
Here's something that worries me, Glenn. Let me get your take on this. If they would not necessarily say, all right, we're ignoring court orders, but in effect, they slow walk them, they obstruct them. Donald Trump is the master of delay, deflection, and obstruction. That's what has me worried.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, I have cut right to the chase when it comes to a scenario where the Trump administration begins to outright violate court orders. I always have nearby the big, ugly blue book of federal laws, the United States Code. I don't leave home without it. Have code, will travel. And one of the things I know from being a career federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice is that the law provides that the U.S. Marshals shall execute federal court orders. Not may, not they can do it unless some Trump official objects to it. They shall. And I will tell you, when we say that the Marshals always get their man or woman, they really do. They are a crack outfit. And so if you look at the law, and it's 28 USC section 566 for anybody scoring at home, here's what it says, plain and simple. It says, the United States Marshal Service shall execute all lawful writs, process, and orders issued under the authority of the United States, meaning federal court orders. And here's the part that I love, and I don't know that a lot of people realize this is in this federal statute. And the U.S. Marshals shall command all necessary assistance to execute its duties. The Marshals take their legal obligations very seriously. And if push comes to shove and Donald Trump tries to plunge us into a true constitutional crisis where he says, I don't care what the federal courts say, including the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't have its own army to enforce its laws and its orders and its rulings. I've got the guns. I'm not doing it. That is a true constitutional crisis. Well, the U.S. Marshal Service is legally obligated to enforce court orders and can acquire all necessary assistance in doing so. Now, I'm not pretending the U.S. Marshals can acquire more firepower than the chief executive who has the military at his disposal. And this is like, Alan, like crazy, science fiction end of day scenarios that we're discussing. But it's felt to me like for a very long time, like Donald Trump is itching to try to find a way to, for example, just deploy soldiers to the streets. He said, why can't they just shoot protesters in the legs? He said, I want people to stand up when I enter the room and salute me the way the North Koreans salute Kim Jong-un. And he's clearly, it seems, trying to align us with Russia. It feels to me like we're going to reach that moment where these questions become questions we're going to need to answer. Can the U.S. Marshals really fulfill their legal obligation and enforce court orders if Donald Trump resists?
Yeah, that's why we have you on, Glenn, because you are the expert in the law. These are aspects of the code that, we were not necessarily familiar with. I'm going to ask you one more question, then I'll turn it over to Sam. What do you think is going to happen with Donald Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship?
Boy, it will be up to the Supreme Court. And let's face it, the Supreme Court has found workarounds, in my opinion, to the express language of the Constitution previously. In the presidential immunity arena, I think there are at least two provisions in the Constitution that contradict what the Supreme Court did when they said, listen, if a president is exercising core constitutional functions, he's absolutely immune from criminal prosecution. To me, that is contradicted by the constitutional requirement that the president take care that the laws of the country be faithfully executed. Kind of the opposite of being able to violate the law with impunity and immunity. And I also think the impeachment judgment clause says, and I will paraphrase, if a president is impeached by the House and convicted on that article of impeachment by the Senate, he can still be prosecuted, indeed, for the exact same conduct for which he was impeached and removed, which I think does away with any
Didn't Mitch
lingering
McConnell
double
say
jeopardy
that?
concern.
He said, I'm
Exactly.
voting against impeachment because this should be settled by the criminal courts.
We have criminal laws, and the president
Mitch
is
McConnell,
subject to
not
them.
some, wild-eyed liberal.
So, and that kind of brings me to answering your question. I mean, I think birthright citizenship is enshrined in the express language of the Constitution. But what does that mean to the Supreme Court? Not a heck of a lot these days.
That's a scary thought. I'm wondering, Glenn, how much damage has already been done, right? Because you mentioned the judge in California ruling that the probationary firings were probably illegal. But a lot of these probationary workers, they're gone. They've moved on. They've gotten new jobs. They don't want to come back. I mean, that scares me a little bit.
Scares me a lot. And what's so upsetting is, when you attach the term probationary employee, some people might think, well, we're just kind of giving them a test drive, kicking the tires, see if we really want them to be part of our civil service club. That's not really what a probationary employee is. It is somebody who has been identified as having the right skills, the right background, the right education, the right training, maybe even the right prior employment if they're not fresh out of college or grad school, to fill a need in the federal government, a particular need. And some of them have been working for 6 months or a year or up to 2 years. Some probationary employees remain on that status until they hit the 2-year mark. And all of a sudden, the Trump administration said, and the dates are important, on February 14th, OPM issued this directive, government-wide directive, to fire all probationary employees and do it by close of business on February 17th, over the weekend. And it wasn't even one business day because the 17th was a holiday. So literally, these employees got no advance notice. They lost their jobs, they lost their salary, they lost their health care. This is chaos and cruelty and callousness, in ways that I wouldn't wish upon my enemy. If my enemy were losing the job, for God's sakes, give them some advance notice, 2 weeks, a month, let them put some plans in place. This was designed to create fear and intimidation and send the signal that this is not a federal government you want to be part of. So why don't you just get out? And, that goes back even earlier to the fork in the road email, where he literally told all federal government employees, resign or else. And the or else was, we can't guarantee you will have a job if you don't resign. This is chaos and cruelty.
I wrote a post on X, and we talked about this on our show, that yes, it's chaos, but it's worse. It's a coup. It's not just creating chaos. It's a deliberate coup against the Constitution and our government.
I would agree. It's a coup from inside, which feels counterintuitive. You feel like a coup comes from outside of government,
Not always.
Trying to seize power. Right. But he is trying to seize all power, including of the other two co-equal branches of government. And you're exactly right. This is an internal coup. And my question is forever, will the Republicans be so desperate not to fall out of favor with Donald Trump that they will give our democracy away? All indicators are yes, but I hope there is a bridge too far for some of them, as there was for Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney.
I'm not optimistic. Not only are they afraid of Trump, but the Republican Party now is MAGA. There's no daylight anymore. These so-called moderate, mainstream Republicans, who are they? 2 or 3 left in the Senate, almost no one left in the House. It's not just that they fear him, but they're on board with him.
Yeah, and I can't explain that. I always thought, I guess naively growing up, that there was a baseline of patriotism below which nobody would fall. And yet a whole political party has blown right through that baseline of patriotism, and they're willing to just give it all up to their leader.
Crazy. Trump recently has been bringing up, the Russia hoax again, right? In his dealings with Zelensky, he, is talking about Putin. He's like, oh, he went through the Russia hoax with me, Russia, Russia, Russia. I know you commented on the Mueller report a lot, especially when you're on MSNBC. Looking back now, what's your analysis of what happened, how it happened, and yeah?
Yeah, so I learned how to be a federal homicide prosecutor from Bob Mueller. He was my chief of homicide. He was, I won't go through his whole background, but before he came to the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, he was the acting U.S. Attorney in Boston. And he said to himself, I just want to learn how to try murder cases. He came to our office under then U.S. Attorney Eric Holder, my first U.S. Attorney of 10 U.S. attorneys. And he said, I just want to be on the line. I just want to go into court every day and try murder cases. And he did that for about a year. And then Eric Holder said, Bob, we need a chief of homicide because our chief left the office. He didn't want to do it, but he did it because he's a company guy in the best sense of that term. And then I was one of his right-hand prosecutors. My office was right next door to Bob. So every day I was in and out of, he hadn't been the director of the FBI. He hadn't been special counsel Mueller. He was just Bob, our boss. And here is what I think I know about the man and his work. When he put together the Trump-Russia report, volume 1 documenting more than 140 contacts between Russia and Russians and Russian officials and Trump campaign folk. And volume 2, more importantly, which documented as many as 10 potential felony obstruction of justice crimes. DOJ policy said, well, because we can't prosecute a sitting president, I cannot announce he committed these crimes. All I can do is set out all of the evidence of the crimes, and any honest reader of volume 2 could conclude for themselves, oh, he committed these obstruction of justice offenses. And here's what I think Bob was thinking, although I never talked to him about this. When the Nixon tapes were revealed, what did the Republicans do? They marched on the White House and they said, you're done. You're done. We've seen your crimes. We've heard them for ourselves. If you stay, you will be impeached and removed. You're done. And Nixon resigned. I absolutely believe to my core that when Bob Mueller delivered as many as 10 felony obstruction of justice crimes by a sitting president, it might inspire the Republicans in Congress to do what they did back in 1974 and tell Donald Trump, you're done. If they had any honor, if they had any loyalty to the rule of law or allegiance to the Constitution, that's precisely what the Republicans would have done. But of course, they didn't, because this is a very different time. I think that was maybe Bob Mueller's miscalculation. He was thinking old school, but unfortunately, we have a very new Republican Party.
Yeah, not only didn't they do anything, it was worse. Bob Barr gets on TV and totally misrepresents the Mueller report before anyone even saw it.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
And Alan, that's not your assessment. That's not my assessment. That is Judge Reggie Walton's assessment in federal district court, who issued an order. He said Bill Barr mischaracterized the Mueller report. He spun the Mueller report. And he said Bill Barr's statements to the American people are contradicted by the Mueller report. And so I was one of those people who instantly referred Bill Barr to the Office of Professional Responsibility at the Department of Justice, because anytime a judge makes an adverse finding about the credibility of a prosecutor, that person goes to OPR.
Why do you think Bill Barr did that? Why did he stick his neck out for Trump on the Mueller report like he did?
I don't know. He was all in with Donald Trump's
Yeah.
illegality and abuse of power until he wasn't at the very end when he got out, tried to save himself and go on the Bill Barr rehabilitation tour, which I wasn't buying for a minute. But, listen, he ultimately had no loyalty to the rule of law or the Constitution. And, I believe I saw him lie when he was being cross-examined. I use that term advisedly by then Senator Harris when he was testifying before the Senate. And she asked him very directly, did anybody at the White House tell you or suggest to you that you should open an investigation into someone? Bill Barr knew the answer to that question.
Of course.
But he didn't want to answer it. So he had to hem and haw and grapple with the word suggested. Come on, Bill, you know what suggested means. And because he was caught and he thought he could get around perjuring himself, what was his answer? I don't know. Guess what? Do you know how many witnesses I put before a grand jury and trial juries in my 30 years? I don't know is not a perjury-proof answer if you do know. And he clearly did know. But one of my fundamental beefs with the way we run our government and our courts is we're not willing to hold the ruling class criminals accountable for their crimes. We're willing to hold somebody who snatches a purse or sells a rock of crack accountable for their crimes. Hell, we might even put them in pretrial detention, but we don't hold the ruling class criminals accountable. And they do enormous damage to wide swaths of the American population. Unless we're willing to wrestle with that upside down priority as a nation, I don't know that we're ever going to move forward all that much.
This is from member Patrick Murray. They say, should the American Bar Association disbar Republican politicians for testing the laws and pushing Trump lies? Or is that a slippery slope? It happened to Giuliani and Michael Cohen.
Yeah, so Patrick, first of all, the American Bar Association, the ABA, doesn't have the power to disbar anybody. Only the state bar, where you are licensed to practice law, can launch an ethics investigation into your conduct and then can hold a modified trial. And there are also some appellate rights that go along with that. And if that process runs its course and the recommendation and the ruling ultimately is that you should be disbarred, then that state disbars you and you can't practice law in that state. That happened to Giuliani in New York. He was disbarred. It happened to Giuliani in D.C. He was disbarred. So to answer Patrick's question, yes, people should be referred to their state bar if they engage in unethical conduct in violation of our professional rules of ethics, or if they violate a law, state, local, or federal. And then that state bar should conduct an inquiry, an investigation, and if need be, a trial. And absolutely, people who hold a law license, if they're lying in their any capacity as an elected official, for example, they should be held accountable. They should be sanctioned. And if it is an offense for which they should lose their law license, they should be disbarred. And here's a little tip for everybody who's listening. Anybody can make a referral to bar counsel. I don't have to be, for example, a member of the New York bar. If I see somebody who is an attorney who has a New York law license doing something illegal or unethical, I can simply make a referral. So anybody can do that.
Let me clarify that, Glenn. So you're telling our audience that any member of our audience who, say, lives in D.C. or lives in New York, whether they're an attorney or not, can make a bar referral.
Yeah, if only attorneys could refer other attorneys, it would be a nice, cozy little club. Okay, you don't refer me and I don't refer you. So a member of the public can also lodge a bar complaint.
That's really useful to know.
Tashdid Khan says, is there a natural bias of groupthink in the legal profession since the bar is made up of like-minded individuals? Do you watch Legal Eagle or other insightful lawyers?
I listen to all sorts of other legal analysts, people like Joyce Vance and Barb McQuaid. And I mean, I could list lots of them, and I learn from them. I mean, Joyce Vance is one of my favorites. She's also an expert on the practice of appellate law. And anytime I have an appellate law question I'm not sure of, I'm texting Joyce, and I've often jokingly said, if Joyce tells me that my middle name is not Lewis, I probably pull out my driver's license and double check. Is there groupthink? So I was a criminal law guy my whole life. A little over 30 years, I was a federal prosecutor, first in Army JAG, prosecuting court-martial cases back in the 80s, doing appeals work as basically a prosecutor in the appeals court as a JAG. I did espionage and death penalty cases. And then I transitioned to the Department of Justice, and I was there for 24 years. I think there can be groupthink among folks who practice, for example, on the prosecution side of the bar versus on the defense side of the bar. But I don't want to speak for everybody and say we're all involved in kind of groupthink and reaching the same conclusions based on the same facts. But, it's one of the dangers of being a lawyer. You tend to think in certain terms. So when people are always asking, well, didn't Trump commit a crime? It's like, well, yeah, it seems that way. But I would need to know that there's enough admissible evidence, first, for me to secure an indictment, and second, for me to satisfy the burden of proof at trial beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the mother of all burdens of proof. So I can't just in knee-jerk fashion always say, oh, he committed a crime there, he committed a crime there. Sir, it sort of appears like he may have violated a law, but that only is the first part of the question. Did he commit a crime?
Beth Brown, with all the legal info that they are allowing Musk to access, is it overly cautious to worry that if I openly protest and continually post anti-Trump posts on social media, that they could make my life a living hell? For example, by just cutting off my SSI, leaving me to appeal and hope to sort it out. And does Trump have the power to misuse the justice system to charge me with being a dangerous, treasonous enemy of our country for continually protesting or speaking out against his administration?
Let me answer the second half of that first. Can somebody be charged with a crime for political reasons, even though they violated no law? The administration, the Trump administration, can try to vindictively prosecute people with no evidence they committed a crime. And I am waiting for the Trump administration to bring its first marquee vindictive prosecution case, which I suspect will be against somebody like Liz Cheney or Jack Smith or, one of Donald Trump's targets du jour. But here is what I am completely confident of. Because I spent 24 of my 30 years prosecuting cases in the courts of Washington, D.C., I know all the judges. I'm not saying I know everyone personally, but so many of them are former prosecutors who I worked with, supervised, tried cases with. Many of them are former public defenders who I tried cases against. I tried murder cases against Judge Tanya Chutkan when she was a PDS attorney and I was a junior homicide prosecutor in D.C. I have the utmost respect for her zealousness, her honor, her ethics, her integrity, and her skills as a lawyer. I thought she was a great judge to have caught the assignment of presiding over the January 6th case, which against Trump, which of course has gone away. But here is what I am 100% confident of. The federal bench in Washington, D.C. is made up of uniformly wonderful jurists who are loyal to the rule of law and the Constitution. What I don't believe they will permit is a vindictive, bad faith, evidence-free prosecution of one of Trump's enemies. Figuratively speaking, I would expect the federal court judges to cram a case like that down the throat of the bad faith DOJ, Donald Trump flunkies who dare to come into court and bring a vindictive prosecution against the Trump enemy.
Do you think that includes Trump-appointed judges?
For the most part, I do. I was covering,
Glad to hear that.
The Carl Nichols of the world, and there are others that I am somewhat less confident in. But I still think even the Trump-appointed judges, remember, when we think back to the 2020 60-plus election challenge cases, every Trump-appointed judge who got one of those assignments ruled against Trump.
Correct.
So I would expect that of all of the trial court judges in Washington, D.C. Of course, once you make and I'm confident that the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals remains loyal to the rule of law and the Constitution. Of course, we've already discussed the Supreme Court, all bets are off. But a vindictive prosecution case would be very difficult to bubble all the way up to the Supreme Court and get them to reverse a ruling by a judge throwing out a case for vindictive prosecution. Now, to answer, I forgot her name. Was it Beth? The first part of her question. Should I be worried about what I'm posting or what I'm saying or what I'm doing on social media? I would never cavalierly tell anybody, don't worry about any of it. But I urge everyone to keep speaking out, keep posting, do it respectfully, but forcefully and critically of a lawless administration. Call your elected officials early and often, everybody from your city council to your United States senator. Make your voice heard, whether you're in a blue state or red state. It doesn't matter, because pressure bursts pipes. And that's one of the ways to put pressure on these elected officials. So I wouldn't say stop speaking out. Don't protest. Don't post things that you believe in your heart you need to say. Just, we have to recognize that we are now in a place as an executive branch where Donald Trump is on his retribution tour. And he has an AG who on day one published a memo with an enemies list. She actually said, here are the people we're going to go after. She had no basis to say that because there hasn't even been an investigation to see whether there was adequate evidence to do anything to Jack Smith and his support staff, to Alvin Bragg and his support staff, to Tish James and her support staff, to the FBI agents who investigated J6 cases, to the prosecutors who prosecuted J6 cases. But she put out that enemies list. And of course, she's paired up with a director of the FBI who has his own enemies list. So be careful, but please don't lay back, don't obey in advance, don't stop speaking the truth that you see when it comes to what's going on inside our government that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, let me summarize some things you said that are very important, because we constantly get questions on our live show. What can we do? How can we? And you mentioned several things. One, anyone can make a bar complaint. Two, you can continue to speak out, to make your points of view heard on whatever media you have access to. Three, whatever state you happen to be in, whatever district you happen to be in, email, call, contact your elected representatives. And then the other thing we've stressed is work on voting. Get people out to vote. I mean, that obviously is in many ways the ultimate sanction. So I think there's a lot of agreement here that there are things that every citizen can do.
And there's something else that I don't know that we think of intuitively these days. We always think about, somehow helping a candidate that we feel strongly about, whether it's donating money, volunteering your time, knocking on doors, phone banking. You can do all of that. But there are organizations who are in court as we speak,
yes,
fighting for our rights. We don't think about, CREW, the Citizens for Responsible Ethics in Washington, are in court fighting for us. In a sense, they're like our lawyers, but we don't pay them, right? Please consider, I don't tell anybody who to give to, but consider finding organizations that are in court representing our interests and our rights, whether it's CREW or Free Speech for People or the ACLU. There's a whole bunch of them out there who are in court right now fighting for us. They're kind of like our lawyers. Please consider helping them in any way you can. Maybe you can just volunteer to help them, do with files or phone calls or what have you. But we can, and getting involved feels good. It feels good because we feel helpless when we sit back and we don't do anything. Anything you do is going to be helpful, and it's going to make you feel good and energized and motivated.
Very important additional point. So that's 4 or 5 things that we've laid out that people can do to try to make a difference. You don't have to just sit back and feel despair.
Yeah,
absolutely. All right, Glenn, we appreciate you being on the show. I learned a ton from you. Is there any final words you want to say to the people today?
Yeah, so my final words is one thing I try to do every day. I post a legal analysis video every day on my YouTube channel, Justice Matters. And I always try to find 1 or 2 points of light amidst the Trump-induced darkness. I admit sometimes those points of light are tough to find. I have to close one eye and squint and turn my head like that, but I'm looking for it. And those points of light really are important because we tend to focus on the negative and ignore the positive sometimes. So we've got, dozens of state attorneys general who are in court fighting for the people of their state, but by extension, all of the people of the United States. That's a really significant point of light because you want to talk about some really wonderful legal staffs. It is in the offices of the attorneys general across all of the states. They're in court fighting for us. The federal district court judges, not just in Washington, D.C., nationwide, I believe, are ready to step up exactly as they did in the election challenge cases in 2020. And then please remember that the 2.1 million public servants, civil servants, government employees, that is the federal workforce. Donald Trump might be trying to hollow out the good, ethical, hardworking public servants, but guess what? He can't. He can't get rid of them. So please support the folks who have chosen to stay and do the hard work of the people by working for the federal government all across the country, because he may be able to get rid of somebody here or there, but he's not going to be able to hollow out the ethical civil service corps. So we have to hold fast and we have to keep fighting.
Last point, can you tell us again how everyone in our audience can access your wisdom?
You can find me on my YouTube channel, Justice Matters with Glenn Kirschner. I've recently launched on Substack because after 6.5 years as a legal analyst with MSNBC, I asked to be released from my contract so I could go out and be 100% independent and actually try to talk across the Great Divide. I'm offering myself up to conservative outlets now, and I'm hoping that I can talk and listen to folks who may disagree with me on policy, but the rule of law, I don't think is right or left. I mean, the rule of law is foundational to a healthy democracy, indeed to a viable democracy. So I'm now over on Substack. People can find me there. I don't put stuff behind a paywall, so just come on over to Substack. And on all of the other platforms, the blue skies, and I try not to do much on Twitter. But I'm just you can Google my name and you'll see all my different platforms there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really did. Both of us learned a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care.